What seems like an ordinary moment at a quiet bus stop on the outskirts of Chicago in the late October afternoon suddenly becomes a turning point that changes everything when a 27-year-old pregnant woman, 7 months along, is left behind with nothing but a loaf of warm bread in her trembling hands. The man who abandons her, her own husband, believes the story ends there as he drives away to another woman waiting in their shared apartment. But he has no idea he has pushed her toward salvation because a powerful man with shadows in his past and a 9-year-old daughter in the back seat of his black Escalade chooses to step out, and alter the fate of both mother and unborn child. What follows is a haunting journey through betrayal, survival, and an unlikely love that neither of them expected, where one cold decision at a bus stop ripples through lives, awakens buried wounds, and sets into motion a collision between the world of the abandoned and the world of the dangerous, and the full weight of what happens next only reveals itself as the story unfolds. If this story has brushed against your heart, please leave a like as a quiet gesture of support and share the video with the people you love. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you will not miss the tender chapters still to come. Ryan's car had already vanished beyond the last curve of the road, leaving Olivia standing alone at the silent bus stop. She looked down at the sandwich in her hand, its warmth still seeping faintly through the thin wrapping, yet that warmth now only made her stomach twist. Her fingers trembled not from the cold, but because her mind could not yet grasp what had happened only a few minutes before. Her husband, the man she had been bound to for 3 years, had just abandoned her here, as if she were an old object no one needed anymore. Olivia forced herself to take a deep breath, telling herself she had to stay calm, had to think of something. She fumbled her phone out of her coat pocket with shaking fingers and dialed Ryan's number. The ring sounded once, then twice, and then a woman's automated voice spilled into her ear, cool and distant. "The number you have dialed is not available." She called again, then again, but the result did not change. He had blocked her. Olivia lowered the phone and stared at the screen as if it had betrayed her yet again. A thought flared in her mind, and she hurriedly opened her wallet to check. Her heart sank when she saw the empty space where the cash should have been. She searched for her bank card, but it was gone too. Ryan had taken everything. She did not know when he had done it, perhaps that morning while she was in the bathroom, or the night before when she had already fallen asleep. He had been planning this for a long time, and she had known nothing at all. The strength vanished from Olivia's legs, and she dropped onto the cold metal bench of the bus stop. The chill seeped through the thin fabric of her maternity dress and climbed up her spine, but she no longer had the energy to care. She sat there, one hand still holding the now meaningless sandwich, the other resting on her belly 7 months along. The baby inside nudged gently, as if it could feel its mother's pain. Then the first contraction hit. Olivia sucked in a sharp breath, her hand tightening over her stomach. "Not now," she begged silently. "Please, not now." She still had 2 months before her due date. She could not give birth here, not at a lonely bus stop on the outskirts of Chicago, with the light fading from the sky. The contraction passed after a few seconds, but it left behind a new fear in her, deeper and darker. A bus roared past without stopping. Olivia tried to lift her hand to wave, but the driver did not even glance in her direction. A few pedestrians moved along the sidewalk across the street, none of them turning their head to look back. She understood then that she was utterly invisible to this world, that a pregnant woman curled up on a bus stop bench was not enough to make anyone pause and ask if she needed help. The October wind grew stronger, slipping through her thin coat as if it were not there at all. Olivia began to shiver at first, just a little, then more violently, beyond her control. The sky shifted from a dull gray to the color of lead, and the last light of day was draining away quickly. She felt her head start to spin, tiny bright specks dancing before her eyes. She had not eaten anything since morning, and the strain and the cold were draining whatever strength was left in her body. Olivia tried to stand, thinking she should walk somewhere, anywhere to find help. But the moment she pushed herself up, the world lurched sideways. The ground seemed to rise up toward her, and she knew she was about to fall. The sandwich slipped from her hand and landed on the bench with a soft thud. She reached out, trying to grab the edge of the seat, but her fingers closed on nothing but empty air. Her vision blurred, the sounds around her stretched and warped as if they were coming from very far away, and the last thought that flickered through her mind was of the child inside her, the child she did not know if she would ever get to meet. She did not see the gleaming black Escalade parked about 20 meters away, or the small pair of eyes watching her intently through the rear window. Inside the black Escalade, Dominic Valenti was bent over a stack of papers in his hands, the faint light from his phone screen casting a pale glow over the sharp lines of his face. In the front seat, Marco sat at the wheel, his eyes flicking constantly between the rearview mirror and the road on either side, with the wary alertness of a man who had long lived in a world where death could come from any direction. In the back, Sophia sat next to her father, a 9-year-old girl with black hair pulled into a neat ponytail after her piano lesson. Her eyes were not on the book resting on her lap. They were drifting beyond the glass, watching the outside world with the pure curiosity of a child. The car was parked about 20 meters away from the bus stop, waiting for Marco to confirm that everything was safe before they continued the drive home. Sophia saw the woman first. The girl noticed her sitting alone on the bench, hunched in a thin coat, her swollen belly pushed forward so clearly that it showed even in the fading afternoon light. Then she saw the woman try to stand swaying, as if her legs could no longer hold her weight, almost pitching forward onto the pavement. "Daddy, that lady is falling," Sophia cried, her small voice tight with worry, as she grabbed her father's sleeve. Dominic lifted his head from the papers, his dark eyes turning toward the bus stop. He saw her, a young woman heavy with child fighting against the betrayal of her own body. One hand clung to the bench, the other wrapped around her belly, and even from this distance he could see that she was shaking badly. Then that image slid over another in his mind, a memory he had tried to bury for nearly 30 years. Another woman, also pregnant, also falling on another street on a winter night, cold enough to burn the lungs. His mother, Lucia Valenti. She had fallen and no one had stopped. No one had helped, and she had died there on the sidewalk with the unborn daughter who never drew a breath. Dominic blinked, forcing the memory back down, but the taste of it lingered bitter in his throat. He looked at Marco in the rearview mirror, and Marco understood the meaning of that glance at once. "Boss Castellano's men are still watching the eastern side," Marco murmured in Italian. "We should not reveal our position right now." Dominic knew Marco was right. He was in the tensest phase of his conflict with Victor Castellano, the old enemy who wanted to seize the Valenti family's territory. Any public appearance could become a weakness, something to be exploited. But when he turned his gaze back to the woman at the bus stop, she was almost collapsing completely, hanging on to the metal bench with the last of her strength. "Daddy, please." Sophia spoke again, her voice trembling. Her tummy is big like a baby inside. "What if she is hurt? What if nobody helps her?" His daughter's question pierced through every layer of armor Dominic had built around his heart. What if nobody helps her? No one had helped his mother, not a single person, and he had lived with the ghost of that truth for his entire life. "Stop the car," Dominic ordered, his voice low and final. Marco wanted to argue, but he had known his boss long enough to understand that when Dominic Valenti used that voice, nothing in the world would change his decision. Dominic opened the door and stepped out, his tall figure cutting a dark shape against the deepening sky. Marco quickly followed, one hand resting at his waistband where his gun was hidden, his eyes sweeping across every angle of the street in case danger rose from the shadows. Sophia jumped out of the car too, ignoring her father's earlier instruction to stay inside. She ran after him, her small legs moving fast along the sidewalk, as if she were afraid that if she did not reach the woman in time, the stranger would fall and there would be no one there to catch her. Dominic heard the quick patter of his daughter's footsteps behind him, and he did not turn to tell her to stop. Perhaps it was because he knew Sophia would not obey, or perhaps because some part of him needed her. There needed the reminder of why he was doing this at all. Dominic Valenti had turned his back on many things in his life. He had walked away while enemies begged for mercy, had shut his eyes to the harsh acts his world demanded of him. But tonight, a 9-year-old child would not allow him to look away. Dominic moved toward the bus stop with steps that were firm yet unhurried, careful not to add to the fear that was already pressing in on the woman before him. Olivia was drifting between waking and oblivion, now her eyes open but unable to focus everything around her, melting into smeared bands of color and faraway sounds echoing as if from the end of a long tunnel. She sensed someone drawing near, and some last faint instinct for survival urged her to pull back, but her body no longer had the strength to obey the commands of her mind. Then a small hand closed around her own, warm and gentle. "It is okay," a child's voice murmured at her ear, clear and strangely soothing. "We are here to help." Olivia forced her vision to steady and saw a little girl kneeling beside her, wide eyes fixed on her, with a kind of earnest worry only a child could carry without shame. Then she lifted her gaze and saw the man standing behind the girl, and a new wave of terror swept over her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black suit that fit his powerful frame, with precise, quiet luxury. The watch on his wrist caught the fading light, a glint of wealth Olivia recognized as the sort of thing that used to be worth an entire year of her teacher's salary. Behind him, another man stood with a guarded stance, his eyes constantly sweeping the area, one hand resting at his waist in a way Olivia had seen often in films about the Mafia. She tried to push herself away from them, reacting like prey that suddenly realizes it is face-to-face with hunters. Dominic saw the panic in her eyes and stopped where he was, leaving a few steps of distance between them. "She needs a doctor," he said, his voice low as he tried to keep it from sounding like a threat. "Let us help you." Olivia wanted to refuse to say that she was fine, that she did not need help from strangers, especially not from strangers who looked as though they had stepped out of a world she wanted no part of. She gathered what little strength she had left and forced herself to stand, both hands gripping the metal bench, as she tried to prove that she could still take care of herself. But the moment she straightened, her knees gave way and she pitched forward. Dominic moved without thinking, arms shooting out with a speed that startled even him as he caught her just before she hit the ground. It was the first time they touched, and the contrast was so sharp it nearly broke her resolve. His hands were warm and steady, while hers were ice cold, as if the blood in her veins had been slowly drained by fear and exhaustion. He eased her back onto the bench with a gentleness that felt strangely at odds with the dangerous power written in every line of his body. "Hospital," Olivia whispered, her voice so thin the wind almost stole it away. "Please take me to a public hospital." Dominic started to nod, but in that instant, Marco stepped up beside him, phone pressed to his ear. He spoke softly to Dominic in Italian, his tone urgent and tight. "Castellanos' men are watching the Eastern Hospital. They have people posted all through the emergency area." Dominic clenched his jaw. If he took this woman to the hospital, Victor's men would see. They would ask questions, start digging, and anything that touched his name could become another card in his enemy's hand. Yet he could not leave her here, not after he had seen her like this, not after Sophia had taken her hand and promised help in that clear little voice. "Take her home," Dominic decided, and there was no space left for doubt in his tone. "Call Elena now." Marco wanted to object, and Olivia wanted to object too, but she was far too weak to form any more words. Dominic lifted her as if she weighed no more than a child, carrying her toward the waiting Escalade with quick, decisive strides. Sophia hurried at his side, her small fingers still trying to cling to Olivia's hand, as if she feared that if she let go, this woman would simply vanish from the world. They settled Olivia in the back seat, and Sophia climbed in beside her at once, clutching her hand and refusing to move away. The car glided forward, and Olivia felt her consciousness ebbing like the retreat of a tide. She caught brief flashes of streets sliding past beyond the window, then houses that grew larger and farther apart. The vehicle passed through a tall iron gate that swung open at their approach, revealing guards in black, who stepped aside with disciplined precision, and Olivia saw a sprawling mansion rise in the glow of warm golden lights. Through her blurring vision, she caught glimpses of high walls, wide, bright windows, a fountain in the middle of the courtyard, and shapes of people moving with the purposeful order of an organized force. She had no idea what world she had just entered, a world of power and secrecy, of danger, hidden beneath polished luxury. And the man who had just saved her had no idea that his enemies would soon learn of her presence and that she would become a piece in a game she did not even know was being played. Dr. Elena Vance reached the Valenti estate in less than 20 minutes after Marco's call. She had been the family's private physician for more than 10 years, and she understood that when Dominic called, she did not ask questions, she simply came. Olivia had been placed in a large sitting room on the second floor, lying on a wide sofa, covered with warm blankets, her eyes still closed but her breathing steadier. Dr. Elena examined her with careful, methodical hands, checking her pulse, her blood pressure, listening to the baby's heartbeat through the cold mouth of a stethoscope. Dominic stood in the corner of the room, arms folded across his chest, watching in silence. She is severely exhausted, Dr. Elena said when she finished her voice grave. Dehydrated, dangerously low blood pressure, and a body that is almost completely spent. The baby is still stable, but if no one had found her tonight, I can't say what might have happened. Dominic nodded once, but the doctor was not finished. She rose, stepped closer to him, and lowered her voice so Olivia would not hear, even though the young woman was still lost in unconsciousness. There is one more thing, she said, her eyes darkening with something that looked very much like anger held in check. She shows signs of prolonged malnutrition, not for a few days, but for many weeks. Her body is severely lacking the nutrients a pregnant woman needs. Someone has not cared for her in a very long time, or worse, someone has deliberately neglected her. Dominic felt his jaw clamp down so hard his teeth ached. He looked at the woman lying motionless on the sofa, at the high curve of her belly, at the pale and hollowed face, where her cheekbones stood out too sharply, and he understood that the man who had abandoned her had not only left her at a bus stop tonight, he had been abandoning her for a very long time, perhaps since she first became pregnant, perhaps even earlier. Take care of her, Dominic told Dr. Elena, his voice low and cold. Whatever she needs, use it. Dr. Elena nodded and went back to work, setting up an intravenous line and giving Olivia several restorative medications. Olivia was moved to a private bedroom on the second floor, a warm room with a large bed and thick drapes drawn over the windows. Sophia refused to leave the little girl curled up in an armchair beside the bed, her eyes fixed on the stranger's chest, counting each rise and fall as though they were her own. Dominic stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at his daughter, then at the woman on the bed, and something in his chest gave a small, sharp twist in a way he had not felt for a very long time. He turned away and went down to his office on the first floor, where Marco was waiting. Find out who he is, Dominic ordered, his voice stripped of any trace of doubt. Everything about him. Name, work address, mistress, bank accounts, everything. And make sure Castellanos' men do not learn that she is here. Marco nodded, but the worry in his face was plain. You know Victor will find out, he said bluntly. He has eyes everywhere. Nothing happens in this city without his knowing it. Dominic looked out the window where the darkness of the Chicago night lay over the city like a vast velvet curtain. Then we will deal with it when he does, he replied, his tone calm, but heavy with meaning. Nearly 20 kilometers away, in an opulent penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Victor Castellano sat in his favorite leather chair with a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. His phone vibrated and he answered, listening to a report from one of the watchers he had scattered across the city. Valenti brought a pregnant woman back to the estate tonight, the voice on the line said, from a bus stop in the suburbs. She looked like she was about to die. Victor set his glass down, a slow smile spreading over his lips. Interesting, he murmured, his voice like the hiss of a snake that has just caught the scent of prey. Find out who she is. Every weakness can be useful. He ended the call and stared out at the glittering web of city lights below his mind, already turning over the many ways he might use this new piece of information. Valenti, the man who prided himself on caution and ice-cold control, had taken a stranger into his home. That meant something, and Victor intended to discover exactly what it was. Back at the Valenti estate, the clock had just struck 3 in the morning when Olivia jerked awake. She sat up with a gasp of panic, heart-pounding, eyes wild as they darted around the unfamiliar room. She did not know where she was, did not remember how she had come here, and in that first stunned instant, she thought she had died, and this was some other world. Then she saw the little girl. Sophia was curled in the armchair beside the bed, her head tipped against the side asleep, with the deep, even breathing of a child untouched by worry. She was still here all through the night, keeping watch over a woman whose name she did not even know. Olivia felt her eyes burn, and then the tears began to fall. She cried without sound, both hands pressed over her mouth, so she would not wake the girl, but the tears would not stop. She did not cry for the pain, did not cry for the man who had left her behind. She cried for something simpler and more piercing, for the fact that someone had cared, that a 9-year-old child had given her what her own husband had denied her for so many months, the bare mercy of being seen. In this world, kindness could become a weapon, and Victor Castellano had just glimpsed a new blade. 3 days slipped by inside the Valenti mansion, And Olivia had grown much stronger under the steady care of Dr. Elena and the nourishing meals that Mrs. Romano, the elderly housekeeper with silver hair and gentle eyes, brought to her faithfully each day. Dr. Elena advised her to stay at least one more week so they could monitor the baby and be sure her body truly recovered. And although Olivia felt uneasy about living under the roof of strangers, she had no other choice. Yet as her strength returned, her eyes began to take in more, and what she saw around her made her increasingly uneasy. There were too many people moving in and out of this house, men in black suits with stiff, disciplined walks and cold, unreadable eyes. Men she quickly realized all carried weapons hidden beneath their jackets. They called Dominic boss, not Mr. Valenti or sir, but simply boss, with a respect laced with fear that she had only ever seen in films about the underworld. She noticed the way Marco shadowed Dominic like a second skin, the way the guards at the gate remained at their posts 24 hours a day, the way the entire house seemed to function more like a fortress than a family home. One afternoon, when Mrs. Romano brought in a tray of tea, Olivia decided to ask directly. "What does Mr. Valenti do for a living?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Mrs. Romano's hands paused for a heartbeat, her eyes flickering briefly before she offered a polite smile that never reached those kind eyes. "Mr. Valenti is a businessman with many different ventures," she replied, her voice smooth and practiced, as if she had answered this question hundreds of times. "He is a very busy man." The answer said nothing, and it was exactly that emptiness that told Olivia everything she needed to know. She did not press further, but the suspicion in her chest grew another inch. Sophia was the one who unintentionally confirmed what Olivia had begun to fear. The girl came to her room often chattering about school, about the piano piece she was learning, about the books she loved. And on one such afternoon, Sophia spoke with the careless honesty of a child and cracked the surface wide open. "Daddy has meetings at night," she said, her big eyes innocent, unaware of what she was revealing. "Sometimes men come and they look scared. Marco says they are business partners, but they do not smile like partners." Olivia felt her blood run cold. She did not know exactly who Dominic Valenti was, but she was smart enough to fit the pieces together. Frightened men, late-night meetings, guns, bodyguards, and that charged fearful respect everyone showed him. She was living in the house of a dangerous man, and she needed to leave as soon as she could. That afternoon, when Mrs. Romano accidentally left her phone on the table in the sitting room, Olivia saw her chance. Her heart pounding, she picked it up quickly and dialed the number of her mother-in-law, Patricia Bennett. The relationship between them had never been warm, but Patricia was still the grandmother of the child in her womb, and Olivia hoped that would be enough to move her to compassion in this desperate moment. The phone rang 3 times before Patricia answered, and as soon as Olivia began to greet her, her mother-in-law's icy voice cut straight through. "I know it is you," Patricia said, her tone dripping with contempt. "Ryan has told me everything. You betrayed my son, you had an affair, and the child inside you is not even his. How dare you call me?" Olivia froze where she stood, the words striking her like knives driven straight into her chest. "No," she stammered, her voice shaking. "That is not true. I would never do that. Ryan is lying. Ryan is the one who betrayed me." But Patricia was not listening. "Do not ever call this number again," she said coldly. "My son has told me what kind of woman you are. You are not worthy of this family's help." Then she hung up, leaving Olivia alone with the flat, empty beeping in her ear. The phone slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a hard, hollow sound. She could not believe it. Ryan had not only abandoned her, he had spun a web of lies to make sure that no one in his family would lift a finger for her. He had cut off every escape, every place she might have turned for shelter. She had thought she had at least one door left open, but she had been wrong. She had nothing. Her knees gave way and she sank to the floor, tears streaking down her cheeks, and she did not even bother to wipe them away. She did not know that out in the hallway, Dominic was standing with his back against the wall, his dark eyes fixed on nothing. He had heard everything from beginning to end, every cowardly lie her husband had told, every cold word of rejection his mother had thrown at her. He did not step into the room, not now, not when she needed to be alone, and simply cry. But his jaw was clenched tight, and in his gaze there was a low-banked flame that anyone who knew him would recognize as the warning sign of a coming storm. She had believed she still had somewhere to go. She had been wrong. And the man standing in the shadows had just been given one more reason to hate the man who had left her behind. 1 week had passed since the call with Patricia, and Olivia no longer spoke of leaving, not because she had accepted staying, but because she no longer knew where she could possibly go. She had no money, no family, no close friends willing or able to take in a woman 7 months pregnant without asking too many questions. And though she still did not fully understand who Dominic Valenti truly was, she knew that he had not harmed her, that his daughter had cared for her as if she were already part of their family, and that sometimes that alone was enough to carry her from one day into the next. That evening, Olivia sat alone on the back veranda looking out over the wide garden, washed in the soft glow of warm golden lights when she heard footsteps behind her. Dominic stepped outside, a glass of liquor in his hand, and paused when he saw her there. He asked quietly if she would mind his sitting down, and Olivia shook her head. They sat side by side for a long while in silence, with only the faint rustle of the breeze moving through the leaves and the distant hum of night insects filling the space between them. Then Olivia decided she had waited long enough. She needed to know the truth, no matter how frightening that truth might be. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice gentle but steady. "Who are you really?" Dominic did not answer at once. He looked down at the glass in his hand and turned it slowly, as if weighing how much to say and how much to keep buried. Then he lifted his gaze, met her eyes, and seemed to decide that she deserved more than evasions. "I run the Valenti family," he said, his voice deep and even. "We control certain operations in Chicago. I am not a good man, Olivia. I have done things that if you knew them, you would run from this house and never look back. But I have my own rules. I never harm women. I never harm children. I never traffic in drugs, the poison that destroys neighborhoods and families. Never." Olivia listened, waiting for the fear she had always imagined she would feel, but it did not come the way she expected. Perhaps it was because he was speaking plainly instead of weaving the easy lies Ryan had used for so long. Perhaps it was because truth, even a dark and ugly truth, was still easier to bear than a sweet deception. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why those rules?" Dominic set his glass down and rose to his feet. "Come with me," he said, and stepped back into the house. Olivia hesitated for a moment, then pushed herself up and followed. They walked along a long corridor lined with paintings and expensive decorative pieces until they stopped before a heavy oak door. Dominic opened it and went inside. It was his office, the one room in the house Olivia had never been allowed to enter before. It was broad and shadowed, with tall shelves running up to the ceiling, a massive desk of dark walnut, and the faint scent of leather and old paper lingering in the air. Dominic went to a bookcase near the window and took down a small framed photograph. He stood looking at it for a few seconds as if gathering himself for what he was about to say, then turned and held it out to her. It was an old black and white picture, worn and slightly faded with time. In it stood a young woman, perhaps around 25, with long black hair and eyes that were gentle yet deeply sad. She was pregnant, her rounded belly pressing against the fabric of a simple dress, and though her lips were curved in a smile, that smile never reached her eyes. "My mother," Dominic said, his voice grown rough. "Lucia. My father was the boss before me, a real monster. When my mother was 8 months pregnant with my little sister, he threw her out of the house. I do not know why, perhaps because she dared to stand up to him, perhaps because he had found another woman, perhaps simply because he could. No one helped her. Not a single person." Dominic paused, drew in a slow breath, and went on. "She gave birth on a sidewalk on a bitter winter night. Neither of them survived, my mother and my sister, the baby I never got to meet. I was 8 years old when it happened." Olivia felt her heart twist in her chest. She looked down at the photograph in her hands at the young woman with the sad smile, and she understood. She understood why he had stopped the car that night, why he could not turn away when he saw her collapsing at the bus stop, why he clung to rules that men like him were not supposed to have. "I took everything from my father when I was old enough," Dominic said, his voice turning colder, though there was a raw ache beneath it. "I rebuilt this family on different rules, but I could not save her. I could not save them." Olivia looked at him, and she no longer saw only the ruthless underworld leader everyone else feared. She saw an 8-year-old boy standing alone in the freezing dark, a man who had carried a lifetime of sorrow and guilt that nothing could erase. She had no words that could possibly soothe a wound, the deep nothing that would make sense of such a loss. Instead, she set the frame gently on the desk and laid her hand over his. Her hand was small against his larger one, but she hoped he could feel the warmth there, the quiet understanding she was trying to offer. For the first time, Dominic did not pull away. He let her hand rest on his, and in that brief, fragile moment, the wall between them seemed to grow a little thinner. "You saved me because of her," Olivia whispered. Dominic did not answer. He did not need to. 2 weeks had passed since the night Dominic told Olivia about his mother, and life inside the Valenti mansion had begun to settle into a new rhythm. Olivia no longer felt like a stranger temporarily taking shelter, but slowly, almost against her expectations, she was becoming part of this house in ways she had never imagined. She woke each morning to Sophia's knock on the door, the little girl bursting into the room to ask if she wanted to have breakfast together, then tugging her downstairs to the kitchen where Mrs. Romano had already laid out steaming plates of food. She saw Dominic in the evenings when he returned from meetings she did not ask about, and sometimes they sat together on the porch and talked. Sometimes they simply shared the quiet, and somehow that was enough. It was during one of these quiet evenings, under the cover of the deepening shadows, that Dominic spoke a name he had not uttered in years. He told her about Isabella Sophia's mother and the wife he had lost to a sudden illness when their daughter was only 2. He confessed how Isabella's death had turned his world to ash, leaving him with a frozen heart he had sworn never to risk breaking again, until a stranger at a bus stop began to thaw the ice he thought was permanent. That morning began like every other, perhaps even more beautifully, because Sophia had begged Olivia to teach her how to bake cookies. They stood in the big kitchen with flour dusted across the cool marble counters, Sophia concentrating hard as she tried to cut the dough into star shapes while Olivia stood at her side, gently guiding her hands. Morning light poured through the large window, casting warm golden streaks across the floor, and Sophia's laughter rose into the air, mingling with the soft scent of butter and vanilla. It was the most peaceful moment Olivia had known since the day she learned she was pregnant, and she allowed herself just for a little while to believe that perhaps life could be all right, that perhaps she had found a safe place. Then the gate bell rang, shrill and urgent, shattering the calm. A shout followed a man's voice that Olivia recognized instantly, and the blood in her veins turned to ice. "I know she is in there," Ryan's voice bellowed from the gate. "That is my wife. That is my child. Open this gate right now." Olivia froze where she stood, her hands still dusted with flour, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it roaring in her ears. Sophia looked up at her wide-eyed and worried, asking what was happening, but Olivia could not answer. All she could do was stand there trembling, while the nightmare she thought she had left behind roared at her from just beyond the iron fence. Outside, Ryan was pounding on the gate, his face flushed red with drink and fury. 2 guards had blocked his path, holding him at a safe distance, while another hurried off to find Marco. In less than 2 minutes, Dominic appeared striding out through the front door with long, deliberate steps. He did not hurry, did not look rattled. He carried with him a kind of cold, contained composure that made anyone watching feel a chill along the spine. Dominic stopped at the gate and regarded Ryan through the iron bars, his eyes as hard and clear as ice. Ryan took one look at him, and even in his drunken state, he understood this was no ordinary man. The expensive suit, the costly watch, the stance of someone who expected obedience, and the gaze of a man who had looked death in the eye and never flinched. "Who the hell are you?" Ryan shouted, his voice still straining for aggression, even as his confidence began to crack. "What are you doing with my wife? A man who abandons his pregnant wife has no right to ask that question," Dominic replied, his tone low and steady, as if he were discussing the weather. Ryan clenched his jaw, unused to anyone speaking back to him like that. "I will call the police," he snapped. "I will tell the whole world my wife is living with a criminal. Who do you think you are to keep her here?" Dominic stepped closer to the gate, and Ryan instinctively backed up a single step, even though iron bars stood between them. "Be my guest," Dominic said, his voice dropping almost to a murmur, each word soft, yet edged with unmistakable menace. "Call anyone you like. But understand this, I know where you live, I know who you sleep with, and I know exactly how much money you took from your wife's accounts. One more word and everyone else will know it too. The color drained from Ryan's face and some of the alcohol haze seemed to burn off as he realized the man in front of him was not bluffing. This was the kind of man who really did know everything and who would not hesitate to use what he knew. Ryan, a voice called from behind Dominic, and both men turned. Olivia was walking toward them, her back straight, her eyes red but dry, her face set with a resolve she had not known she possessed. She came to stand beside Dominic, not touching him, but close enough that Ryan could not mistake where she had chosen to stand. "Go home, Ryan," she said, her voice so calm it surprised even her. "I am not coming back. Not ever." Ryan looked at her, then at Dominic, then at the guards waiting with their bodies tense to act. He wanted to say something, to scream, to tear at the gate, but he did not dare. He turned and stumbled away, his steps unsteady, but just before he passed out of sight, he glanced back one last time, and in his eyes there was a pure, undiluted hatred, the kind that takes root in a man who has been humiliated and has no way to strike back openly. Ryan Bennett had come here to reclaim control, to drag Olivia back, and prove that he was still the one who held power. Instead, he walked away carrying fear and a burning shame in his chest. And fear, shame, those are the feelings that most often drive people toward very foolish choices. The bar sat on the corner of a rundown street on the south side of Chicago, the kind of place where the neon lights flickered weakly and the smell of old beer had seeped into every brick. Ryan Bennett sat hunched at the counter with his fourth or maybe fifth glass of whiskey in front of him. He had stopped counting. It had been 3 days since he had been humiliated in front of those iron gates, 3 nights when he had not been able to sleep because the rage inside him boiled over every time he remembered the way that man looked at him as if he were nothing more than an insect not worth a second thought, and Olivia, his wife, had stood beside that man and chosen him instead. He tossed back the last of his drink and motioned to the bartender for another. The rent would certainly be late this month, but he did not care. He only wanted to drown the crushing helplessness that was grinding him up from the inside. Megan had not answered his calls for 2 days. She had been keeping her distance ever since he had phoned her drunk in the middle of the night and poured out his misery about Olivia. He was losing everything, and he had no idea how to get any of it back. A man slid onto the empty stool beside him, and Ryan did not bother to look up. But when the newcomer called to the bartender in a low, warm voice and said to put the next drink for my friend here on my tab, Ryan finally turned his head. The man looked to be around 40 years old, wearing a charcoal suit cut with quiet precision and a watch that caught the dim light with a sharp glint. His dark hair was combed smoothly back his face, all planes and angles, with a friendly smile that never quite reached the sharpness of his eyes. "You look like you have had a rough day," the man said, his voice carrying the lilt of someone with Italian roots. "I am Tony Greco." He held out his hand, and Ryan, even through the haze of alcohol, was clear-headed enough to notice that this was not the sort of man who usually drifted into a cheap bar like this. Even so, the liquor had muffled his caution, so he shook Tony's hand and gave his own name. "Ryan Bennett," he said, and yes, rough day is putting it mildly. Tony gave a small chuckle and ordered 2 more whiskeys, a much better quality than what Ryan had been drinking. They began to talk, and Tony, with quiet skill, asked questions and listened with close attention. And Ryan, who was lonely and angry and desperate for someone to hear him, began to spill everything. He talked about Olivia, about how long he had had to put up with her, about how the pregnancy had made her impossible in his eyes, about the decision he made to walk out, because he believed he deserved to be happy. Then he told the story of the rich bastard who had stolen his wife, of the big mansion and the guards, and how that man had humiliated him at the gate. "Sounds like this guy thinks he is untouchable," Tony said, nodding with sympathetic understanding when Ryan finished. "Men like that, sometimes they need to be taught a lesson." Ryan gave a bitter laugh and drained his glass. "I wish I could," he muttered. "But he has money, power, everything. Me, I am just an office guy with a bank account running dry." Tony fell silent for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he leaned a little closer, lowering his voice. "What if I told you I know some people who do not like him either?" Tony said, his eyes fixed on Ryan's. "People who are willing to pay very well for information about him." Ryan blinked, trying to force his thoughts through the fog of the drink. "What kind of information?" he asked, his tone carrying the first faint hint of caution. "Anything," Tony replied softly. "Where he lives. Who comes and goes. That woman. Anything you know." You will be paid fairly, and you will get to watch the man who shamed you pay for it. Ryan hesitated, a small, sober part of his mind, screaming that this was dangerous, that he should walk away. But then he thought about the rent coming due, about the settlement a lawyer might demand if Olivia decided to drag him into court, about Megan pulling away because he was no longer the generous man who had first attracted her. "How much do I need to do?" he asked. And in that moment, he sold his soul without even realizing it. Tony smiled, and the curve of his mouth was colder than anything Ryan had ever seen. They talked for another half hour, and Ryan told him everything he could remember: the location of the mansion, the number of guards he had seen, the man named Marco, who never left the boss's side, Olivia, and the child she carried. Tony listened, nodded, and finally slipped a thick envelope into Ryan's hand. "Consider this a down payment," he said. "Stay in touch." When Tony left the bar, he walked to a dark alley nearby and pulled out his phone. He dialed a memorized number and waited until someone picked up. "He agreed," Tony said, his voice now stripped of warmth, cool and professional. "Desperate and stupid husband, the perfect combination." On the other end of the line, Victor Castellano laughed, a deep, calculating sound that echoed through the luxurious penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. "Good," Victor said. "Valenti has been far too careful lately. This might be the opportunity we need." At that same moment in the Valenti estate, Marco stepped into Dominic's office with a grave expression. "Someone is asking about her in the city," Marco reported. "About the woman you brought in. They are digging for information." Dominic lifted his head from the file in front of him, and his eyes darkened. "Castellano," he said, though it was hardly a question. Marco nodded. "Most likely. He is making his move." Dominic Rose walked to the window and stared out at the Chicago night spread over the city like a great black sheet. He had known Victor would learn about Olivia sooner or later, but he had not expected it to happen quite so fast. And if Victor was asking about her, that meant he had already found a way to use her as a weakness. Ryan Bennett thought he was taking back control by selling scraps of information to strangers. He did not understand that he had just turned himself into a pawn in the game of men far more dangerous than he was, men who would sacrifice him without a second thought the moment he stopped being useful. 3 weeks had passed since the night Ryan had appeared at the gates of the estate, and Olivia had moved into the 8.5 month of her pregnancy, her belly now so large that every step was an effort, with Dr. Elena coming to examine her twice a week and reminding her each time that the baby could arrive at any moment from now on. Olivia could feel a change in the house. Even though no one told her anything directly, the number of guards had doubled. Men in black suits now patrolled through both day and night, and she often saw Marco conferring with Dominic in the office, their low voices in Italian tight with tension. She knew something was happening, something tied to the world Dominic ruled, yet she did not ask, partly because she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer, and partly because she believed that if there was anything she truly needed to know, he would tell her himself. That night, the biggest storm in 10 years rolled into Chicago. The wind howled like some furious beast. Rain came down, as if the sky had split open, and thunder and lightning tore the darkness again and again. Trees snapped and crashed across the city streets, flooded, and then the lights in the mansion flickered a few times before going out, completely dropping everything into thick shadow. The generator kicked on and sent a faint glow into the most critical parts of the house, yet the air was heavier than ever, a kind of strange stillness pressing on everyone inside. Marco rushed into Dominic's office, his face pale in the wavering light, as he reported that Castellano's men were on the move, at least 3 cars heading toward the estate, using the chaos of the storm to strike, while the police were busy trying to manage the citywide damage. Dominic rose to his feet, his jaw clenched. This was the moment he had been preparing for over many weeks, yet the timing could not have been worse. And when he asked how many men they could bring to bear, Marco answered that they had enough to hold them off, but he needed a decision whether Dominic would stay inside or go out to confront them himself. Before Dominic could answer, a scream rose from the upper floor, Mrs. Romano calling his name with a panic she could not hide, and he took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding, then pushed open Olivia's door to find her lying on the bed, her face white as paper, both hands clamped around her belly as waves of pain tore through her, while Mrs. Romano tried to calm her with trembling hands. "The baby," Olivia gasped, her eyes wide with pure fear. "The baby is coming." Dominic rushed to her side and knelt beside the bed, telling her that she still had 2 weeks left, as if the words alone might change what was happening. But Olivia gritted her teeth and forced out that the baby did not care about schedules, that it was coming right now, and he had better believe her. Dominic turned to Marco in the doorway and ordered him to call Elena and get the car ready because they needed to get her to a hospital at once. Yet as Marco pulled out his phone, his expression darkened while he checked the situation and reported that Ashland was blocked by fallen trees. Michigan was underwater with no vehicle able to pass, and the nearest hospital was already overwhelmed by storm-related accidents and rerouting every case that was not considered urgent. "This is an emergency," Dominic roared, and Marco answered that he knew it was his voice stretched taut as wire. But there was no way to reach the hospital in these conditions, and certainly not while Castellanos' men were on the road coming their way. For a single heartbeat, Dominic stood caught between two worlds that both demanded him. At once outside, an enemy was advancing with guns, and murder in their minds inside, the woman he had sworn to protect needed him more than she ever had before, and he made his choice in an instant. "Marco, take the men and stop Castellano," he said, his voice suddenly calm in a way that was almost frightening. "Keep them away from this house, no matter what it costs." "I am staying here." Marco nodded once and vanished, his footsteps pounding down the stairs while Dominic called Dr. Elena, who could not reach them through the blocked roads but agreed to guide him over the phone. They moved Olivia down to the large sitting room on the first floor, where the generator still gave them enough light, and under the doctor's instructions, Mrs. Romano began to gather everything they would need for a home birth: clean linens, hot water, whatever might help them bring a child safely into the world. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her small face pale, yet her eyes bright with determination, holding a large flashlight that did not shake in her hand as she stepped into the room and asked what she could do to help, her voice steadier than many of the adults. Dominic wanted to send his daughter away, to keep her safely out of the storm that had moved inside their walls. Yet when he looked into her eyes, he saw the same courage that lived in him, and instead told her to hold the light for him and to stay calm so Olivia could see it in her. And Sophia nodded and came to sit beside Olivia, one hand gripping the flashlight, the other clasping the hand of the woman who was biting her lip against each wave of pain. From a distance, the crack of gunfire filtered in through the roar of the wind and the rumble of thunder. Marco and his men clashing with Castellano's forces. Somewhere out there in the dark rain, swept streets, and Olivia heard the shots, and her eyes flew open as she clutched Dominic's hand where he knelt beside her and asked what was happening outside, her voice shaking. Dominic met her gaze, and in that moment chose to do something he rarely allowed himself. He lied in order to protect her, telling her there was nothing she needed to worry about, that all she had to do was focus on him and on the baby they were about to meet. Outside, two rival powers collided in the storm rain, and blood mingling on the black pavement, while inside, a woman fought to bring new life into a world lit only by a flashlight, and the steady hands of strangers who had become her family, and Dominic Valenti, the boss of the most powerful family in Chicago, knelt on the floor between these two battles, utterly resolved that he would not lose either one. 6 hours crawled by like 6 long years in the sitting room of the Valenti mansion. Olivia lying on the sofa that had been covered with layers of white towels, her hair soaked with sweat, her face twisted with every fresh wave of pain that tore through her body. Dr. Elena was still on the line, her voice on speaker calm and professional, even though everyone in the room knew this was far from the way a woman should have to bring a child into the world. Mrs. Romano followed each instruction with hands that trembled slightly, yet never lost their precision, while Sophia remained at Olivia's side, holding the flashlight steady and refusing to leave even though her father had told her more than once to go outside and rest. Dominic stayed beside Olivia through the entire night, close enough for her to grip his hand every time a contraction hit to squeeze, until his knuckles turned white, and he did not complain, not once. Outside, the fight raged on bursts of gunfire rolling in with the storm, sometimes close, sometimes distant, tangled with the deep rumble of thunder that still growled overhead. Marco had taken 12 men to intercept Castellanos' forces, and from the short calls that came between firefights, Dominic knew they were locked in a brutal struggle. 2 of his men badly wounded, but their enemies paying just as dearly, Marco and the others holding the line and pushing them back from the estate, though the battle was far from decided. Near 5 in the morning, when the storm had begun to ease but the sky was still black as ink, the worst moment came. Olivia was screaming through another savage contraction when suddenly she stopped, not because the pain had passed, but because she no longer had the strength to cry out. Her eyes drifted shut, her head lolled to the side, and her body went limp like a puppet with its strings cut. Mrs. Romano checked her, and the color fled from the old woman's face. "The baby's heart is very weak," she said, her voice shaking. "Doctor, the heartbeat is dropping." Dominic felt as if someone had driven a fist straight into his chest. He had faced down guns more times than he could count, stared into the eyes of men who wanted him dead without the slightest tremor, but now looking at Olivia's bloodless face and hearing the fragile thud of the baby's heart through the monitor they had set up on Elena's orders, his hands began to shake and would not stop. He gripped Olivia's shoulders and shook her gently, his voice roughened by a fear he had believed himself long past feeling, telling her to stay with him, hearing the plea in his own words and hating that helpless note, begging her not to dare leave, not now, not like this. Sophia broke into tears, clutching the flashlight to her chest as sobs streaked her cheeks. Mrs. Romano whispering prayers in Italian under her breath, while Dr. Elena, still on the phone, rattled off urgent instructions that Dominic could barely hear. He could see only Olivia, could focus only on her face. And in that instant, memory slammed into him, his mother Lucia, the woman who had fallen on a frozen sidewalk and never risen again. And he knew he could not let it happen a second time. He could not lose another woman this way. Then Olivia's eyes opened. She looked at him, and in her gaze he saw something he could not name, perhaps a fierce resolve, perhaps the last hidden reserve of strength a mother finds when there is nothing left for herself but everything still to give for her child. She said nothing, only tightened her grip on his hand one more time, then gathered what remained of her strength and pushed with everything she had. Her cry ripped through the strained silence of the room, and a heartbeat later, another sound followed, the sharp, wet wail of a newborn baby. Mrs. Romano caught the child in her trembling hands, wrapped the tiny body in the waiting white cloth, and the baby's cry rose louder, stronger, as if declaring to the world that it had arrived, and that it meant to stay. "A boy," Mrs. Romano said through her tears. "A healthy boy." Dominic stood there, unable to move, unable to speak, until Mrs. Romano placed the baby in his arms, and he felt the small, solid weight of that new life settle against his chest, felt the heat of it seep through the cloth and into his skin. His hands were still shaking and his eyes burned in a way he had not allowed in many years. He was Dominic Valenti, the boss of Chicago, the man an entire city whispered about in fear, and he was standing there with a newborn in his arms and tears pressing at the backs of his eyes. At that moment, Marco stepped into the room, his suit spattered with blood, though the way he carried himself made it clear that it was not his own. He took in the scene with a single glance, then nodded to Dominic. "It is done," Marco said. "They have pulled back." Dominic nodded in return, then sank to his knees beside Olivia and gently laid the baby in her arms. "You did it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "He is perfect." Olivia looked down at her son, her face still pale and drained, but her eyes glowing with a light Dominic had never seen in her before. Sophia dropped to her knees beside them, staring at the baby with round, astonished eyes. "He is so tiny," she breathed through her tears. "So beautiful." Outside, the storm finally broke apart, and the first thin rays of dawn slipped through the windows, bathing the room in a soft gold, where this new life had just entered the world, a child born in the heart of a tempest between gunfire and thunder, caught by the hands of a man who had been ready to die to keep him safe, even though he was not the child's father. 2 days after the storm, while Chicago was still sweeping up the wreckage of that terrible night, Dominic sat in his office with Marco going over the aftermath. Morning sunlight poured through the window, but the air in the room stayed heavy with the news Marco carried. Castellano had pulled back after the clash, his men badly hit, 4 of them, seriously wounded, and 2 taken by the police as they tried to flee the scene. Yet Marco knew, and Dominic knew, that Victor Castellano was not the sort of man who gave up so easily. He was retreating to redraw the map, to search for another angle of attack, and that was more dangerous than any open confrontation. "There is something else," Marco said, his voice dropping lower as if the words themselves carried weight. They had traced the source of the information Castellano had about the estate. The number of guards the woman under Dominic's roof, and when Dominic lifted his head and narrowed his eyes to ask who, though some part of him already knew, Marco answered without softening it, that it was the husband that he had sold her, had told Tony Greco where she was, who she was, that she mattered to Dominic, that he had betrayed his wife and unborn child for a fat envelope of cash in a cheap bar. Dominic said nothing at first, simply sat there with his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his temples trembled, and the silence stretched long enough for Marco to begin to feel uneasy, until Dominic finally spoke, and his voice was so cold it might have frozen the room as he asked whether she knew. And when Marco said no, Dominic answered that it was better that way, that no one was to tell her not yet, not when she had just given birth and needed rest more than anything, that this piece of truth could wait its turn. Marco nodded and left him alone with the anger burning in his chest, and Dominic rose and went to the window staring out at the garden, where crewmen were clearing fallen branches and broken stone, though his thoughts were far from the tidy paths and clipped hedges. He was thinking about Ryan Bennett, about the coward who had not only walked away from his pregnant wife, but had sold her out in order to make money and take petty revenge, and he promised himself that he would deal with that man, just not today, not while Olivia still needed quiet to heal. Upstairs in a room washed in soft light and perfumed with fresh flowers, Mrs. Romano had carefully arranged, Olivia lay on the bed with her tiny son in her arms. Dr. Elena had arrived as soon as the roads opened again and had pronounced both mother and child healthy in spite of the hard labor. Sophia sat beside them on the bed, her gaze never leaving the small sleeping face, and in a whisper meant not to wake him, she asked what his name was, and Olivia looked down at her boy and remembered the conversation she had had with Ryan when she first learned she was pregnant, how he had wanted to call the baby Ryan Jr., and she said so in a quiet voice that held a trace of bitterness she could not quite hide, then added that the name no longer fit. She lifted her head and saw Dominic standing in the doorway, and realized he must have been there for some time without her noticing. He stepped into the room and moved toward the window, turning his back to her, his shoulders bearing a weight she could not name but could feel, and as she watched the line of his back, a sudden thought came to her. "What was your grandfather's name?" she asked, and Dominic turned surprise showing on his face in a way he almost never allowed, repeating the question as if to be sure he had heard correctly, then answering that his mother's father had been named Luca, and asking why she wanted to know. Olivia smiled, the first true smile that had touched her lips since the storm, then looked down at the child in her arms and said softly, "Lucas, I will name him Lucas." Dominic stood there, unable to speak, because she was naming her son after his family, after the mother he had lost, after the name that had once belonged to a young girl who had been bright and full of life before his father destroyed her, and she did not know that her former husband had betrayed her, yet again had sold information about her to his enemies, and come within a breath of causing her death in the storm. She did not know any of that, but somehow she still knew who deserved to be remembered in the name of her child. 3 weeks had passed since the night Lucas came into the world, and life inside the Valenti mansion had settled into the shape of a real family in ways none of them had ever quite expected. Olivia had fully recovered from the hard labor, the color had returned to her cheeks and a quiet light had come back into her eyes, and Lucas was a strong, loud little boy who cried often, demanded to be fed every few hours, and dragged the entire household into wakefulness at the loneliest moments of the night. Sophia adored him so fiercely that she spent nearly all her free time sitting beside his crib, watching him sleep with wide, worshipful eyes, and had promptly crowned herself his unofficial big sister, while Mrs. Romano cooked rich, nourishing meals for Olivia and fussed over all of them with the soft devotion of a grandmother, and Dr. Elena came regularly to check them both and make sure mother and child were thriving. Yet beneath all that warmth, Olivia began to notice that Dominic was drawing away. He was still there, still asking after her, and Lucas every day still sitting down to dinner with them when he could, but something in him had shifted. He spent more and more time shut in his office with Marco, their meetings stretching late into the night, and sometimes Olivia would catch sight of him standing at a window, his face carved with a worry he tried to smooth out the moment she entered the room. He was planning something, she could feel it, something that belonged to his own shadowed world, the world he had always tried to keep her on the far side of. One night long after midnight, When the clock had already struck 2 in the morning, and the house lay wrapped in deep quiet, Lucas's cry cut through the hallway like a thin, urgent thread of sound. Olivia sat up at once, her instincts sharpened by 3 weeks of broken sleep, pulled on a light robe, and hurried toward the nursery. But when she pushed the door open, she discovered she was not the first one there. Dominic stood beside the crib, his shirt rumpled as if he had not changed since daylight, leaning over to look at Lucas with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something soft and tender and aching all at once. "You," Dominic said when he realized she was there, his voice low and rough with fatigue. I heard him crying. "I came first." Olivia stepped closer, and they stood shoulder to shoulder at the crib, looking down at Lucas, kicking and bawling in outrage at the world. She bent to lift the baby, and Dominic moved to help with the small blanket, their hands brushing both of them, going still for a heartbeat, as the thin silvery moonlight slipped through the window and filled the room with a gentle glow that let her see every line in his face, the deep furrow of worry in his brow, the dark smudges of sleeplessness under his eyes, and something deeper in his gaze when he looked at her. They did not pull their hands away, left them touching while she rocked Lucas and soothed him until his cries slowly faded into small, sleepy sighs. And when she finally laid him back into the crib, she turned to Dominic. "Something is wrong," she said quietly but firmly. "You have been so distant these past days. Is it because of me? Because I named the baby the way I did?" Dominic looked at her, and for a second, the walls he had spent a lifetime building seemed to waver. "No," he said, his voice steady. "Never because of that. That name means more to me than you know." "Then what is it?" Olivia asked, taking one small step closer. "Tell me." He was silent for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal and how much to hold back. Then he drew in a breath, and when he spoke, his words carried the tiredness he had been hiding for weeks. "There are people who want to hurt me," he said, "and now they know about you. I am trying to protect you, but to do that I may have to make choices that, once you see them, will change the way you look at me." Olivia listened and found that she was not as afraid as she had always imagined she would be. Instead, there was a strange, steady calm in her chest, a quiet acceptance she had not known she possessed. "I already know who you are, Dominic." She answered, her voice soft but unwavering, "And I am still here." The silence that fell between them was not awkward, but full, the silence of two people standing at the edge of something larger than either of them, and unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Dominic lifted his hand and touched her cheek, and she felt that hand tremble, the hand of a man who ruled an empire with iron control, shaking as it brushed her skin. "You deserve a better life than this world," he whispered. "Maybe," Olivia replied, neither stepping back nor looking away, "but this world saved me." No one said the word love. Not yet. But they both understood that the line between them had been crossed a long time ago. That morning began like any other in the Valenti mansion, with Sophia's laughter drifting up from the dining room, and the smell of fresh coffee threading its way down the hallway, while Olivia sat in the front room nursing Lucas, the soft sunlight pouring through the wide window and laying warm golden stripes across the wooden floor, when one of the guards stepped in, carrying a large brown envelope. He handed it to Mrs. Romano, and the housekeeper's face blanched a little when she read the name of the sender, before she hurried it straight to Dominic's office. 10 minutes later, he appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, with the envelope already opened in his hand, and a look on his face that told Olivia at once that something was wrong. He walked over and sat beside her without speaking, at first his gaze resting on Lucas nursing so peacefully at her breast, and then he held the envelope out to her and said in a low, strained voice that she needed to read this. She took it with one hand, her heart beginning to race even before she saw the words, pulled out the sheaf of papers, and started to read. And with every line, the color drained a little more from her face. It was a petition from an attorney, the formal complaint of Ryan Bennett, her legal husband, suing for full custody of the newborn child, accusing her of raising the baby in an unsafe environment, specifically of living with a man alleged to be involved in organized crime, and asking the court to grant sole custody to the father. When she reached the end, her hands began to shake so badly that the pages slipped free and fluttered to the floor like autumn leaves, and she whispered in a strangled voice that he was going to take Lucas, that he would take her son. "No one is taking your child," Dominic said, his tone hard as forged steel. "No one." In that moment, Marco strode in with a grim expression, bringing fresh news from his own sources that made everything far more tangled. This was not the husband's idea. He told Dominic Castellano was behind it, paying for the lawyers the best in the city, that this was not about the baby at all, but about forcing Dominic into the open, dragging into daylight the connection between him and the woman he had taken in. Olivia looked from Marco to Dominic, trying to make sense of what she was hearing, repeating the name Castellano, the man who had attacked on the night of the storm, and Dominic nodded, his eyes darkening, as he said it was the same man, that when Victor could not beat him with bullets, he turned to other weapons, that if Dominic stepped forward to shield her openly, he would have to show his face in court and answer questions about who he was and what he did. But if he did nothing, she might lose Lucas. Dominic rose, and in that instant, Olivia saw a different version of him. No longer the man who had stood beside her in the moonlight the night before, but the boss Chicago whispered about in fear. Gather everyone, he told Marco, his voice like ice and sharp as a blade. Reach out to every informant we have. I want everything on Castellano's operation for the last 3 months. Every deal, every shipment, every meeting. We are going to deal with him permanently. Marco nodded and disappeared, leaving Olivia sitting with the baby in her arms and a cold shiver moving slowly up her spine. She looked at Dominic standing with his back to her shoulders, drawn tight as if he were trying to hold up the whole world, and she asked what he was going to do. Her voice small but steady. Dominic turned to her, and in his eyes burned a fire she had never seen before, as he said he would do whatever was necessary to keep her and Lucas safe. She wanted to press him to know exactly what that meant, but some part of her understood that there were answers she was not meant to hear. Instead, she simply nodded and held Lucas closer to her chest. That afternoon, Nathan Cole arrived at the estate, a middle-aged lawyer with salt and pepper hair and sharp, watchful eyes, who had been working for the Valenti family for more than 20 years. He sat with Dominic, and Olivia read through the complaint with a cool, professional focus, then gave his opinion, saying the case was weak in the eyes of the law, that Ryan had abandoned her while she was pregnant, emptied her cash and bank cards, ignored her entirely, for months without support, and that any judge would see him as an irresponsible father trying to game the system. But Nathan went on, his voice turning more grave. If the other side could prove that she was living in a dangerous environment, that could change everything, and they would need evidence against Ryan, proof of abandonment, of reckless behavior, of anything that could shatter his credibility in court. Dominic nodded, and Olivia knew in that moment that he already had a plan, perhaps from even before Nathan walked into the house, perhaps from the second he first read the papers. This was no longer just a legal dispute, it was a fight for survival, and she understood that in the world Dominic Valenti ruled, battles of survival were the one kind of fight he did not know how to lose. The old Italian restaurant on the south side of Chicago had stood on that corner since the days when the grandfathers of both Dominic and Victor were still clawing their way up to build their empires. A place considered neutral ground, where by the unwritten laws of their world, no one was allowed to start trouble. No one was allowed to carry weapons inside, and every conversation was treated like a diplomatic treaty between nations. Dominic arrived 10 minutes early and took a table in the back corner, with Marco standing beside him, his loyal lieutenant forced to leave his gun at the door, like everyone else. Victor Castellano walked in the moment the clock struck 8 in the evening, wearing a deep blue suit tailored to perfection. His silver hair combed neatly back, and that usual smug smile playing at his mouth. Tony Greco trailing behind him like a faithful shadow as they sat down across from Dominic, as if this were nothing more than a friendly reunion between old acquaintances. Dominic Victor began, his voice smooth as oil. Though Dominic could hear the poison underneath it, has been a long time since we sat down like this. And Dominic answered in a flat, emotionless tone that the last time had been at Victor's father's funeral, the man Victor had killed, and Victor only shrugged as if they were discussing the weather, saying that was old history, and he had called this meeting to talk about the present, about the woman. Dominic said nothing, only watched him with eyes like ice and waited. Victor leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table, telling him she was a burden, that anyone could see it, that she was a pregnant woman he had picked up at a bus stop, and now he was entangled in a custody suit over a newborn, that Dominic did not need that kind of trouble and should throw her back, let the husband take the child, and Victor would leave him alone. She is under my protection, Dominic replied, every word clear and final, not open to negotiation. Victor leaned back and laughed, his laughter ringing through the nearly empty dining room like a cracked bell, asking if Dominic truly meant protection or something more, mocking the great Dominic Valenti, the man all of Chicago feared for falling for a pregnant stray he had found on the street, and saying Dominic's father would be ashamed. Dominic's expression did not change, but the air around him seemed to drop a few degrees as he lowered his voice until it was as quiet and dangerous as a snake's hiss, and reminded Victor that his father was dead by his hand, and warned him not to make him repeat what happened to those who crossed that line. For the briefest instant, Victor's smile vanished and Dominic saw a flicker of fear in his eyes before arrogance covered it again. Victor rose slowly and buttoned his jacket, saying this was not over, and Dominic agreed without getting up, quiet and unhurried, that it was not. Victor turned to leave with Tony following, but at the door he paused and looked back to say that, in this game, the men who let their feelings get involved were usually the first to die. Dominic did not answer, only watched him disappear through the door while the outline of a plan formed more clearly in his mind. At the same time, in a luxurious penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Ryan Bennett stood shaking in front of Victor Castellano Tony, having summoned him there half an hour earlier, with a message that the boss wanted to see him, and Ryan the fool had come, without the faintest idea what waited for him. Victor sat in a large leather chair like a king on a throne, studying Ryan with the cool, assessing gaze of a man, appraising a piece of merchandise, telling him that his wife was living with Dominic Valenti, not as a question, but as a fact, and asking if Ryan knew who Dominic was, explaining that he was the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, and that Ryan had sold him information about her without the slightest idea of what kind of game he was stepping into. Ryan felt the blood in his veins turn to ice and stammered that he had not known, that he had only wanted revenge, only wanted to take back what was his, that he had not known who Dominic truly was. Victor rose and moved closer until he loomed over Ryan, larger and heavier, his presence pressing down like a stone, as he said in that frighteningly gentle voice that Ryan wanted revenge, and Victor was giving it to him, that the lawsuit would go forward and his best lawyers would see to it that Ryan had a chance to win, but that when it was all over, Ryan would belong to him, and asked if that was understood. Ryan wanted to say no, wanted to turn and run, but when he looked into Victor's eyes, he saw something that told him refusal was not on the table, that he had stepped into this world the moment he took that fat envelope from Tony in the cheap bar, and it was far too late to go back. He understood, he whispered, and Victor smiled and clapped him on the shoulder as if they were old friends, telling him to go home and wait, that they would be in touch. Ryan left the penthouse on trembling legs, and when he stepped into the elevator, he caught his own reflection in the mirrored wall, saw a coward, a traitor, a man who had sold his soul to a devil in order to punish his own wife, and was only now beginning to grasp the true price. The board was set, the pieces were in their places, and Ryan Bennett, who had imagined himself a player, finally began to realize he was nothing more than a pawn, waiting to be sacrificed in the game of men, far more powerful than he would ever be. For 3 weeks after the meeting at the old Italian restaurant, Marco and Dominic's crew shadowed every move Victor Castellano made, patient and meticulous, logging each truck, each late-night rendezvous, each phone call they managed to intercept, piecing together a full portrait of their enemy's empire, and what they uncovered filled Dominic with anger and a hard, grim satisfaction all at once. Victor was moving drugs through the Chicago docks, shipments of cocaine and heroin worth millions of dollars hidden inside legitimate cargo containers and slipped into the city once a month. Exactly the kind of business Dominic had sworn would never stain his territory. The line he had drawn the day he overthrew his own father and rebuilt the Valenti family on different rules because drugs tore apart neighborhoods and families, and he had vowed his empire would never stand on that kind of ruin. Marco laid the file on Dominic's desk, photographs, recordings, hard proof that could not be talked away, and told him he had 2 choices. The first, a direct strike to destroy the shipment and wipe out Victor's men, a move that meant open war, blood on both sides, and no one knowing when or how it would end. While the pictures on the desk showed Victor shaking hands with traffickers, containers being unloaded under cover of darkness, the distribution lines threading out through the city, and Dominic thought of Olivia and Lucas, of Sophia, of everyone he was sworn to protect, knowing that an all-out war would put every one of them in the crosshairs, and that he could not allow that. He asked about the second option, And Marco looked at him with a small, knowing smile, saying he could let someone else do the dirty work, that the federal agents had been watching the drug trade at the port for a long time, but did not yet have enough to move, and that if someone happened to give them very precise information about the time and place of Victor's next shipment, the balance would change, and Dominic saw it at once that he would not have to fire a single shot, that no more of his men would bleed, and Victor would be taken out by the very legal system he despised, wiped off the board with a warrant instead of a bullet, a move his father would never have imagined, because the old man had only ever believed in brute force, but Dominic had learned that sometimes the most effective weapons were not guns at all. Do it, he told Marco. Make sure the information lands in the right hands and leaves no trail back to us. While Marco set that quiet plan in motion, another battle was unfolding in the court of public opinion. Caroline Hayes, a well-known investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune, published a long piece with a headline that hit the city like a slap: abandoned at the bus stop. The true story of a pregnant woman left behind, telling in painful detail the story of Olivia, from the afternoon her husband left her at a lonely bus stop on a cold October day, to the moment she was taken in and cared for until her child was born. And the most explosive part was a video clip, grainy but clear, pulled from a nearby traffic camera, showing Ryan Bennett placing a sandwich in the hands of his pregnant wife and walking away without a backward glance. Outrage erupted almost at once, the hashtag Justice for Olivia rising across every social platform, and Ryan Bennett became the focus of a national fury, branded a monster, a man without a conscience, an embarrassment to his gender, while his employer was flooded with emails and phone calls demanding his dismissal, and Megan, his lover, stopped answering his calls the day the article appeared. What stunned Ryan most was discovering the source of the story. Caroline Hayes had been tipped by an anonymous woman who gave her both the video and intimate details of his marriage to Olivia. And when he read those details, he knew only one person could have known them all. His mother, Patricia Bennett, who had seen the footage on the news, had recognized her own son, and instead of clinging to the lies he had fed her, had chosen to stand on the side of the truth. On the very night Caroline's article was published and spreading like wildfire, federal agents launched a raid on the Chicago docks, storming in at the exact moment Victor's men were unloading a container packed with pure cocaine, and Victor Castellano, the crime boss who had believed himself untouchable, was arrested on the spot along with more than 20 of his closest lieutenants. Only Tony Greco slipped away, vanishing into the night like smoke, but Victor's organization shattered in a single blow. Marco called Dominic with the news, and Dominic only nodded, saying nothing, then set the phone down and turned to the window, where the lights of Chicago shimmered in the darkness, like a million fallen stars. Victor Castellano had tried to use the shadows to bring Dominic Valenti down, scheming in secret, moving pawns like Ryan Bennett across the board to strike from behind. Yet in the end, it was that same darkness that swallowed him whole. News of Victor Castellano's arrest swept through Chicago like wildfire, every broadcast replaying the same image of the Mafia boss in handcuffs being let out of the docks in the middle of the night, his face drained of color under the harsh bursts of camera flashes, and now he was staring down federal drug trafficking charges, the kind that could lock him away for at least 25 years if the court found him guilty. The empire he had spent decades building collapsing in a single night, while those who had once trembled at his name scrambled to sever every tie they had to him. Ryan Bennett watched the coverage from his small apartment, the hand holding his drink shaking so badly the liquor rippled against the glass, knowing the federal agents would dig into the life of anyone connected to Castellano, and that he, the man who had taken money from Tony Greco to sell out his own wife, would certainly be on that list. He called the lawyer Victor had hired for him, and no one answered. He tried Tony's number and found it dead, and he understood he was alone now, completely alone in a world he had stepped into without the slightest understanding of what it would cost him. At the Valenti estate, Dominic sat across from Olivia in the sitting room with Lucas sleeping peacefully in the crib beside them, and he knew he had postponed this conversation for too long. But now that the threat from Castellano had been neutralized, he could no longer put off the truth. "There is something I need to tell you." He began, his voice low and serious, about Ryan, about the night Lucas was born, and Olivia looked at him with worried eyes because she had felt for weeks that he was holding something back. but she had never imagined it would circle back to her husband. He did not only abandon you, Dominic said, each word landing between them like a stone. He sold information about you to my enemy. The attack on the night Lucas came with the storm, and your labor that happened because of him. Because he told them where you were, who you were, that you mattered to me. Olivia sat there unable to speak, as if someone had pulled all the air from her lungs, remembering that night, the gunshots cracking through the roar of the storm, the terror of bringing her child into the world between thunder and bullets, and now realizing all of it had come from the man she had once called her husband. He tried to kill me, she whispered, her voice trembling, and our son. He did not understand the full consequences, Dominic said, struggling to keep his tone calm even as he watched the pain ripping through her. But he did not care either. He wanted revenge, he wanted money, and he was willing to sell you to get both. Tears began to slide down Olivia's cheeks. But when Dominic looked closer, he saw they were not born of sorrow alone. Her eyes were lit with a fire he had never seen in her before, the pure fury of a woman who discovers that the man she once loved has tried to destroy her and her child. I want him to pay, Olivia said, and now her voice no longer shook. It rang like tempered steel. Not just in court, I want him to know what he has done. I want him to see the outcome of his choices. He will pay, Dominic answered, laying his hand over hers. But we do this the right way. The court first, let the law take whatever it can take, and the rest I will handle. In Ryan's apartment, his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, and after a moment of hesitation, he answered, only for the voice on the other end to freeze his blood. Ryan Bennett, Tony Greco, said, cold and threatening. My boss may be in prison, but I am not, and I want you to understand something. The lawsuit continues. You will go to court, you will fight for custody, and you will not back out. Is that clear? And Ryan stammered that he could not, that the federal agents were investigating, that if they traced his dealings with Castellano, he would end up in prison himself. Tony laughed, a sound like ice sliding down steel, and told him that if he withdrew, he would not live long enough to worry about federal charges, that the boss might be behind bars, but still had men on the outside, that Ryan knew too much was a danger, and dangers needed to be dealt with. The call ended and left Ryan sitting in the dark, the phone still pressed to his ear long after the line had gone dead, and he looked around the cramped apartment that he had once imagined as the fresh beginning of a new life, after he freed himself from Olivia and realized he had turned it into his own cell. The federal agents could arrest him for his ties to Castellano. Castellano's people could kill him if he tried to retreat, and the very lawsuit he had set in motion was becoming another piece of evidence against him in the eyes of the public. Ryan Bennett had wanted freedom, freedom from his wife, from responsibility from the child he had never wanted, and now he understood the price of that freedom, to lose everything or to die. Tony Greco stood in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of Chicago, looking over the faces of the few men left from Castellano's once fearsome crew. Only 6 of them, now 6 men against the hundreds Victor had commanded before he was taken away, and Tony had tried to reach the others, the ones who had sworn loyalty to their boss. But no one answered. They had scattered like rats fleeing a sinking ship, and he knew deep down that he ought to do the same. Still, he could not stomach the idea of walking away and letting Dominic Valenti win without paying any price at all. So he stood there, turning over possible angles in his mind, ways to attack, weaknesses to exploit, when his phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number, and the blood in his veins turned cold as he read the few stark words telling him to leave Chicago that night or not leave at all. There was no signature and none was needed. He knew who had sent it, and he knew Dominic Valenti did not make empty threats. He looked around the warehouse one last time at the frightened, uncertain faces staring back at him, and understood that his time in this city was over. Victor was behind bars, the network shattered, and Valenti was watching his every move. If he stayed, he would die, not today perhaps, but soon, and Tony made his decision in a heartbeat, telling the others to scatter and look out for themselves, that it was finished. Before he left, he made one last call, dialing Ryan Bennett, who answered at once with a voice choked by panic and desperation, babbling that he did not know what to do, that federal agents were investigating, and he was sure they would come for him any day now. And Tony cut him off with a voice stripped of all the easy friendliness he had worn the night they met in the bar, telling Ryan to fend for himself, that he was leaving Chicago, and could not care less about the custody case, wishing him luck in court. "Wait," Ryan shouted, "you can't leave me like this." You and Victor made promises, and Tony replied that he had promised nothing, that Ryan had always been just a pawn, and the game was now over. And then he ended the call, leaving Ryan standing in his cramped apartment with the phone in his hand, understanding he had been abandoned yet again. His night was not finished, though, because the front door opened and Megan walked in, not even glancing at him, as she strode straight to the bedroom and began stuffing her things into a large suitcase. And Ryan stumbled after her, asking what she was doing, though he already knew, and she turned to him with a face as cold as glass, telling him she was leaving, that she had read the article, had seen the video and the comments, that people were already starting to figure out who she was, and she had no intention of letting her name be dragged through the mud alongside his. He grabbed at her hand and begged her not to go, reminding her of what they had shared, of the love she had claimed to feel. And she yanked her hand free and told him in a razor-sharp voice that they had never truly been together, that he had simply been useful, a man with money and an apartment and the means to give her what she wanted, but that now he had nothing and everything around him had become poisonous. He stood there in stunned disbelief, listening to the woman he had left his wife for speak to him with the very contempt he had once reserved for Olivia. And Megan rolled the suitcase out without a backward glance, the door slamming shut behind her, leaving Ryan alone in the stripped-down apartment, suddenly realizing that he had just lived through exactly what he had done to Olivia. Abandoned, written off as useless, tossed aside like something old and broken. At the Valenti estate, the air was entirely different. Dominic walked into the sitting room where Olivia sat nursing Lucas, and there was a lightness in his face she had never seen before, as he told her it was over, that Castellano sat in a cell awaiting trial, and Tony Greco had left Chicago, that particular shadow gone from their lives. And when she asked about Ryan, her voice was calmer than she expected, as Dominic answered that the court would deal with him tomorrow, that the law would finish what they had begun. They sat side by side in a gentle silence, and for the first time since the afternoon, Olivia had been left at that lonely bus stop. There were no dark shapes lurking at the edge of their world, no threat hanging over their heads, and Dominic reached for her hand, and she did not pull away as he told her that after tomorrow, she would be free, completely free. Olivia looked at him, at the man who had found her in the cold and taken her in, who had stood between her and every danger that came for her and her child, and she understood that the freedom she wanted was not freedom from him, but the freedom to stay beside him without fear. Justice comes in many forms, she thought, sometimes at the end of a gun, and sometimes through the slow weight of the law. Tonight it had arrived as both. The morning of the hearing dawned over Chicago with a clear blue sky, as if the city itself were quietly blessing what was about to happen. Olivia walked into the Cook County Courthouse with Nathan Cole beside her, the silver-haired lawyer carrying a worn leather briefcase filled with the evidence they had spent so many weeks assembling. She wore a simple navy dress that fell cleanly along her frame, her hair pinned back in a neat knot, and although her heart beat faster than usual, her face was calm and unwavering. Dominic did not come with her. They had agreed that his presence would only complicate the case and give Ryan an excuse to drag attention away from his own guilt. Yet when Olivia stepped into the courtroom and took her place at counsel table, she glanced toward the back row and saw Marco seated there, his sharp eyes sweeping the room with his usual watchful ease. And she knew Dominic was somewhere out of sight, close enough, that silent knowledge bringing her more strength than any speech could have. The courtroom door opened again, and Ryan Bennett came in, and for a moment she almost did not know him. The man she had married, the one who had once walked with such easy confidence and careless pride, was now thinner, his cheeks sunk in dark circles carved under his eyes as if he had not truly slept in many nights. His clothes were creased and tired, no longer pressed and polished, and he walked alone without a lawyer at his side. Castellano was no longer paying for the glittering legal team that had been promised, and Ryan did not have the money to hire his own. He would have to defend himself, a desperate man floundering before a system he barely understood. The proceeding began, and Nathan Cole laid out the case with the cool precision of a seasoned craftsman. First came the traffic camera footage from the bus stop, projected on a large screen for everyone in the room to see Ryan placing a sandwich in the hands of his pregnant wife and turning away, leaving her standing alone in the October cold, and a hush settled over the courtroom as the images flickered past. Then came the messages between Ryan and Megan, pulled from his phone, revealing that their affair had begun months before Olivia ever knew she was expecting. After that, Nathan walked the judge through the financial records, the transfers from the shared account to Ryan's private one, the withdrawals of cash, the way he stripped their funds and took her cards before he disappeared. Finally, a surprise witness stepped forward, Patricia Bennett Ryan's own mother, who testified against her son, speaking of the lies he had told her, the false accusations he had made about Olivia's infidelity to ensure his family would turn their backs on his wife, and the remorse she carried for believing him. Yet the most devastating blow came at the end. Nathan rose once more and introduced a new set of documents, his voice clear in the expectant stillness, as he told the court they had evidence that Ryan Bennett had deliberately provided information about Olivia's location and identity to dangerous individuals in exchange for cash information used to plan an attack on the home where she was staying, the attack that had taken place on the very night their son was born. The room erupted in a wave of shocked murmurs, the judge forced to bring the gavel down several times before order was restored. Ryan sat frozen, his face drained of all color, his mouth open yet empty of words. He had known somewhere in the back of his mind that he had lost long ago, but there, with every ugly fact laid bare under the bright lights, he finally felt the full weight of what he had done. The ruling came swiftly. The judge needed little time to decide. Ryan Bennett was stripped of all parental rights to Lucas, ordered to pay child support each month, and a substantial sum in damages to Olivia for the emotional and material harm he had caused. It did not end there. As the last words of the judgment faded, two federal agents who had been waiting at the back stepped forward and read a notice detaining Ryan for questioning about his ties to the organization of Victor Castellano. He was handcuffed there in the courtroom, and as they led him away, he turned back to look at Olivia one final time, his eyes full of despair and regret, and perhaps even a plea, as if he wanted her to say something, to reach out in some impossible way and save him. Olivia met his gaze and was startled to discover that she felt no hatred and no thrill of vengeance, only a deep and quiet release spreading through her chest. She was free of him, Lucas was free of him, and that was all that mattered. She turned away and did not look back when the courtroom door closed behind Ryan. He had once begged for freedom, freedom from family, from duty, from the pregnant wife he had decided was nothing but a burden. Now he had finally found that freedom within four narrow walls, waiting for federal agents to question him about crimes he had never dreamed would follow him into the light. 3 months had passed since that fateful day in court, and life had reshaped itself in ways Olivia had never dared to dream of during the darkest days of her past. Victor Castellano had received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison on drug trafficking charges, his empire shattered completely, and no one in the underworld spoke his name with awe any longer, only with caution or contempt. Ryan Bennett had been given 18 months for his ties to organized crime, a lighter punishment than he truly deserved, but long enough for him to sit in a cold cell and think about every choice that had brought him there. Tony Greco had vanished without a trace. No one knew where he had gone, perhaps hiding in some country with no extradition treaty, living each day, with the fear that the shadow of Dominic Valenti would find him when he least expected it. Inside the Valenti estate, everything was different. Olivia was no longer a guest, no longer the rescued woman waiting to recover so she could leave. She was part of this home now, the woman at Dominic's side, a second mother that Sophia loved, and the mother of Lucas, the child born in the heart of the storm, who now grew up surrounded by love. Dominic and Olivia had not rushed to put a label on what lay between them. They had let it grow on its own, from gratitude into trust, from trust into love. And now when they woke beside each other each morning, when they took turns caring for Lucas and shared meals with Sophia, none of them doubted what they had become. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, Olivia took Sophia to the supermarket to buy food for dinner. Lucas stayed at home with Dominic, and the two females, one grown and one still a child, walked slowly through the aisles with a cart that grew fuller with each thing they chose. Sophia chattered about school, about the piano piece she was learning, about all the ordinary things that matter to a 9-year-old, and Olivia listened and smiled, her heart warm with that simple happiness she had once believed she would never know. Then they reached the bread section, and Olivia stopped. She reached out and picked up a fresh loaf, still warm from the oven, and suddenly time seemed to stop. Memories surged back in a flood, the warm weight of a loaf in trembling hands, a lonely bus stop in the fading light. The October wind cutting through thin fabric and Ryan turning his back and walking away without once looking over his shoulder. She remembered exactly how that day had felt. The shock, the hurt, the desolation that came with the realization that she had been abandoned with nothing but a loaf of bread as a parting gift, as if that was all she was worth. Liv Sophia's voice sounded beside her, tugging her back into the present. "Are you okay?" Olivia blinked, looked down at the loaf in her hand, then at the girl watching her with worried eyes, and she understood then that the memory no longer hurt. It was still there as sharp and clear as ever, but it no longer had the power to bring her to her knees. She smiled at Sophia, a real smile that rose from somewhere deep inside. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, "I am okay." They bought the bread and went home where Dominic waited with Lucas in his arms, and a rare, easy smile on his face as he watched them come through the door. Dinner was prepared in the warm, familiar kitchen, and when they all sat down at the table, Olivia began to slice the loaf into thick, soft pieces. Dominic watched her, and as if he could read her thoughts, he asked quietly if she was all right. Olivia paused, looked down at the bread already cut, then lifted her gaze to his. "Ryan handed me a loaf of bread when he left me." She said, her voice steady as if she were talking about the weather. "As if I was nothing. As if I were some stray animal he was driving away. But now it is only bread. It has no power over me anymore." Dominic did not try to answer with words. He simply reached out and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Sophia watched them with shining eyes, even though she did not fully understand the story, and Lucas sat in his high chair, banging his little hands on the table, with the pure joy only a child can have. They ate dinner together, four people making a family not from shared blood, but from shared choice, passing around slices of warm bread, while their laughter rose and filled the cozy room. The past does not disappear, it never truly goes away. The memories remain, the scars stay. But the past loses its power when we no longer fear it. And tonight the loaf of bread was only a loaf of bread. 1 year later, autumn returned to Chicago, October bringing its blaze of golden leaves and that familiar cool edge in the air. And Lucas was now a year old, toddling his first wobbly steps around the mansion. His tiny legs unsteady, but full of stubborn courage. And every time he fell, he pushed himself back up with a wide grin, as if falling were simply part of the adventure. While Sophia, now 10 taller and a little more grown, loved him no less still, the most devoted big sister any child could hope for. That night after Sophia and Lucas had gone to bed, Dominic led Olivia out into the back garden, where the full moon washed the lawns and roses in soft silver light, and the air held the faint perfume of late-blooming flowers. They walked in silence for a while, savoring the peace they had fought so hard to earn, until Dominic stopped beside the fountain, the murmur of the water weaving a gentle music through the dark. He turned to her, and in the moonlight she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. A nervousness, a fragile uncertainty that did not belong to the feared ruler of a city, but to a man standing at the edge of the most important question of his life. And then he drew a small box from his jacket pocket, and Olivia felt her heart skip a beat as he said quietly that he had never thought he would ask anyone this again. That after Isabella died, he had believed that part of his life was over, but that she had brought him back to the living had given him a reason to believe in something beyond power and fear. He opened the box, and inside lay a simple diamond ring, catching the moonlight like a drop of captured starlight, and he asked in a voice barely above a whisper if she would stay forever. Olivia looked at him, at the ring, then back into his eyes, and smiled the brightest smile she had ever worn, telling him she had stayed long ago, but yes, forever, and he slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, holding her as if letting go might make her vanish, the two of them, standing there in the garden under the moon. Two souls who had found each other through storm and darkness, and were now promising to walk together through whatever remained. The next afternoon, the whole family went out for a stroll, Dominic and Olivia, Sophia, and Lucas riding in his stroller, wandering along familiar streets under warm gold light, filtering through trees already turning color, and somehow their feet led them to the bus stop. Olivia stopped and looked at the metal bench she knew so well at the tired shelter, and the lonely street lamp standing guard beside it, and memories rose like a tide. Yet this time they did not drag her under. A year before, She had stood here alone, shivering in the cold wind, abandoned by the man she trusted most, with no money, nowhere to go, sure that she might die right on that frozen metal seat. And now she stood here with her family, with a diamond ring on her finger, with her son sleeping in the stroller, with the man who loved her, and the little girl who had helped save her life. Sophia tugged on her hand and asked why they had stopped, and Olivia answered softly that this was where everything started, where her father had found her. And Sophia's eyes widened as she remembered exclaiming that it was also where she had begged him to stop the car, because that lady looked like she was about to fall, and Dominic looked down at his daughter with a rare, unguarded smile that only his family ever saw, and told her it had been the best decision he had ever made. Olivia knelt so she could meet Sophia's eyes, resting her hands on the girl's small shoulders and telling her thick voice that she had saved her life that night, and Sophia threw her arms around Olivia's neck and whispered that now Olivia was her family, which was even better. They stood there a little longer, four people who had chosen one another, gazing at the metal bench where a story of pain had begun and had somehow become a story of love and redemption. Then they turned and walked away from the bus stop, leaving it behind them as they moved toward the future they were building together. The story that began at a bus stop did not end there. It ended here, in motion, in choice, in the steady belief that those who dare to stand for the truth and those who choose to see the ones who are falling and still decide to stop for them will never truly be abandoned. Dominic Valenti had built an empire on fear and power, yet the greatest thing he ever built was this: a family risen from the wreckage, bound not by blood, but by decision. Olivia looked at the man beside her, at the ring on her finger, at the girl holding her hand and the child in the stroller, and remembered that a year ago she had nothing but a loaf of bread and despair, and now she had everything, all of it born from the moment a 9-year-old girl looked out of a car window and said, "That lady looks like she is about to fall." Sometimes salvation comes from the places no one expects. Sometimes the monster in the dark is the one who pulls you back into the light, and sometimes a loaf of bread is only a loaf of bread once you stop being afraid of what it used to mean. This story leaves us with gentle, hard-won lessons about life, that we must never judge people only by how they appear, because the ones who seem most dangerous may carry the kindest hearts, while those who claim to love us may become our deepest betrayal. That the kindness of a child can change the course of an entire world, as Sophia did when she helped save 2 lives without even knowing it. That life can push us to the very bottom of despair. And still there is a light at the end of the tunnel if we do not give up, and that true family is not always the people who share our blood, but the ones who choose to stay, choose to love us and stand beside us through every storm. If this story has touched something in your heart, we invite you to subscribe so you can join us for more moving and meaningful stories each day. And a single like or a share from you can help this story reach more people and carry its quiet hope a little farther into the world. We would love to hear what you feel after walking with Olivia on her journey, whether you have ever known someone like Dominic, someone who seemed cold and dangerous on the outside, but turned out to have a fiercely loyal heart, or whether there was a time when someone reached out a hand when you were at your lowest and helped you stand again. Please share your own story in the comments, because we are always grateful to listen to the honest feelings that come from deep inside our viewers. Thank you sincerely for spending your time with this story today, and may you and your family be blessed with good health, simple joys, and days filled with peace and quiet happiness. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to meeting you again in the next story.